afternoon.
Good afternoon, Father.
Or maybe good evening. I have to say this not because I am now in this parish, but I have to say this from an objective point of view that this is one of the most beautiful parishes in the Archdiocese of Baltimore. Yeah. It is. It is one of the most beautiful, amazing parishes in this archdiocese, and I am so proud to be here and to be one of you. And you'll get to know why in the course of this homily. So that's the introduction. Whenever I reflect on the early church, whenever I reflect on the early church and the way they lived together, how the early church were devoted to the teachings of the apostles, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, to prayer, and the way they lived together, I could only re-echo what was said about the early church, about the early Christians. See how they loved themselves. See how they loved themselves. And that is why, one of the reasons why I said this is one of the most beautiful parishes. See how you love yourselves in this parish. So see how they love themselves. And that was what I said. This was said about the early Christians because of the way they lived together. They shared all they had in common. So people who saw them could say these of them. See how they loved themselves because they lived in unity. So everyone was important. Everyone was important. Everyone in the early church had a sense of belonging, a sense of participation. Everyone had a space to be. Everyone had a space to be. And that's the truth. That's the point. Everyone is important in the church. This is your house. This is your place. And you could turn to the person next to you and tell him or her, you are important. You could say that. You are important. Say that. Turn to the person next to you. You are important. Exactly. You have a place. You have a place in this church. You have a place in this church. You are important. Because we are all priests and prophets and kings. And Peter today, in the second reading, Peter tells us that we are living stones. We are living stones. Yeah, Christ is the cornerstone, but we, the members of the church, we are the living stones. Because in us and through us, God is building this spiritual house. We are not dead stones. We are living stones. It means that we are called to be active, not passive. We are called to be present, actively, fully present, and not absent, and not indifferent. So we are living stones. Through us, God is building his spiritual house. And you all have a place. Now, despite the fact that everyone is important in the church, we are all important, and we all have a place in this church. This is our house. This is your place. We should never forget that the church is always in need of renewal. The church is always in need of renewal because there is always the need for more growth, more transformation, more healing, more renewal. And when we go back to the first reading, what happened? The Hellenists complained against the Hebrews that their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. So what do we call that? That the Hellenists complained against the Hebrews. They complained to the apostles that their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. What do you call that neglect? You could call it discrimination. Yes, you may be right. You could call it segregation, you could call it racism, you could call it bias, you could call it prejudice. Because when you read the Bible, you come to see that these elements existed. These elements existed in the early church. Peter himself was reprimanded for eating with Gentiles. Recall what happened in the early church, that the Jewish Christians insisted that the Gentiles must have to be circumcised before they become Christians. So we had these elements of prejudice, racism, discrimination, even in the early church. So the early church had a fair share of the problems we have today in our society. They had a fair share of it. Hellenists, the Greeks, they complained against Hebrews, Jewish people, and they complained to the apostles who were Jewish people that their widows were being neglected. And what did the apostles do? What did they do? They had to appoint 7 deacons to resolve the problem. And that for me is very important, because they prayed over them. They prayed over them to carry out this mission, the ministry of distributing food equally. Isn't that amazing? And it speaks to the fact that there is no ministry in the church that is lesser than the other. There is no ministry in the church that is less important. Just as we are all important, every ministry in the church is as important as the other. Yes, we are all in need of priests to celebrate the Mass, yes. But we also need the order service to help to serve at Mass. We need the lectors to help to read at Mass. We need the choirs to help to sing at Mass. We need the ministers of hospitality to help us during Mass. So we all need one another, because we are all living stones. Living stones, and through us, in us, God is building this spiritual house. And that is why we should not be ashamed to come to the table with our gifts and our talents. Because God has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. And that is how the church comes alive. When you and I are able to bring our gifts and use our charisms in worship and in the praise of God. We are a holy people, consecrated people, set apart to declare the praises of God, who has called us out of darkness into his wonderful light. How do we declare his praises? It is with the gift he has given to us, with the charisms he has bestowed upon us. St. Paul says we have to fan into flame the gifts we had received when hands were laid on us. You've got the gifts. But the beauty about this is that they were sent. They didn't just go by themselves. I mean, they had to be sent. Because no one sends himself or herself. Not in the Catholic Church. Maybe you might have this in other churches, but certainly not in the Catholic Church. No one sends himself or herself. We have to be sent. Why? Because this is the work of God. It is not my own personal project. It is God's own work. We have to be sent. We have to be commissioned. And that implies that we become ambassadors. We are representatives of the church. We are representatives of God. Jesus said to Philip, to have seen me is to have seen the Father. That is exactly what happens when we go on the mission. To see us is to see Christ in us. It is to see the church in us when we embark on this mission. So I just cannot come to this place and I am preaching my own gospel. No, I have to preach the gospel of Christ because I am representing him. I have to preach the gospel of the church because I am representing the church. And this means, my dear friends, that when we are sent out on this mission, we just have to realize, my dear friends, that it belongs to us to be open and obedient to the voice of God and to respect the intention of the one who has sent us. We have to underline that. We have to respect the intentions of the one who has sent us. What is the intention of God for sending you and I out to be missionaries, to be apostles and disciples? What could be his intention? It is to save souls. That is the ultimate intention. It is the salvation of souls. That everything we do in the church, when we use our gifts and our charismas and our talents, when we embark on this mission, we have only one objective. Not to us, God, not to us, but to your name be the glory. That is the objective. That is the goal. That's the aim. To your name be the glory. And it's so important, my dear friends, that in this early church, I just love the way they live together. And you could see that the apostles became, and this is so important, they became agents of integration. The Hellenists, Greeks, complained against the Jewish people. They complained to the apostles who were Jewish people. But the apostles, in their wisdom, could appoint and pray over 7 deacons to resolve the problem. And by so doing, they brought about integration of cultures, integration of races. That is exactly why this parish is beautiful. Because you've got the integration of cultures, the integration of languages and races. And I feel like calling this parish the United Nations of Colombia. The United Nations, of Colombia, and maybe Father Jerry could be the President General of the United Nations, and Martin over there, you could be the Secretary General of the United Nations. Yeah, because you could see, cultures coming together. This is what it means to be Catholic. This is exactly the beauty of the Catholic Church. That, every tribe, every race, every language could have a place. And you could have your voice. And you could be heard. Because you belong here. You are part of the living stones in and through which the spiritual edifice is built. And so our strength lies in our diversity. But it lies in the proper management, effective management of our diversity. Because if we are not able to manage our diversity, then it becomes our weakness. And that's the truth. When the diversity is not managed, it becomes a sort of weakness. And that's why here in this parish, we have, the diversity and inclusion group. We have the, Horizon Foundation. We have lots of groups and solidarities who are really right into social justice issues, promoting equality and human rights, promoting our freedom and our oneness as a people of God. That is so beautiful. That is why this parish stands out. And what did the apostles do that really struck me? They defended the widows. They stood in the defense of the widows. And that should be the duty of the church. That should be the mission of the church today. Not to side with the oppressors against the oppressed. As a church, we must side. We must take sides with the oppressed. We must be the voice of the voiceless, the hope of the hopeless. We must take sides with the victimized. Because when we do that, we are doing it for Christ. Whatever you do to the least of these brethren, you do it for me.